Did I ever tell you the story of Andrew Crosse, the man who could create life? Well, hello everyone. This was a Star Wars joke, and this is CM Kozaman. It's a very nice summer night here, and tonight we're going to be talking about Andrew Crosse, the man who could, in brackets, create life, and a very strange experiment that he performed. Now, we're having copious amounts of tea, coffee and ice cream, and it's a very nice night. And this story is mostly about what in scientific terms is called abiogenesis. That is to say, the creation of life from non-living materials. And for a great length of time, people believe that life came not from other living things, which is our accepted view now, but instead they believe it came from certain mixtures of unliving things like certain amounts of mud or a primordial liquid or something like that. And the curious case of Andrew Crosse was one of the last gasps of this outmoded but fascinating idea. So, this is going to be a shorter podcast than the 1 or 2 hour long bombs I've been dropping lately, but I hope you will enjoy it. And without much ado, let's begin with Andrew Crosse's amazing experiment and how he created what he called the perfect insect. But before that, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and please consider donating money to me on patreon.com. Even $1 goes a long way. If you donate $1 now, on the next podcast, you will be paying for this amazing tea I'm sipping, as I talk about the most marginal stories in natural history. So, let's go. Andrew Crosse. He was a British scientist of the Victorian era, and he was born in 1784 near Broomfield in the UK. And he studied in the Brasenose College in Oxford, which is a pretty reputable institution. So he's no Dr. Frankenstein, and in fact this story has been told so many times in so many different angles that it always makes him sound like the scientist who was out there trying to create life, where in fact Andrew Crosse had studied mineralogy and was mostly interested in experimenting with electricity and the generation of mineral crystals under the influence of electricity. So he was not a Frankenstein type of character. He was actually quite well educated and quite a reasonable based kind of guy. And long story short, in an article published in 1837 and disseminated in various scientific journals of the time, including the American Journal of Science and then in Nature, these are very long-standing, reputable publications. So some really serious bits of science get published there for the first time. So it's not like this guy was a crank. He was a pretty based researcher. And long story short, he was actually experimenting with a diluted solution of what he calls the silicate of potash, which I believe is potassium crystals, and then he made a big setup in order to influence the growth of crystals by electricity. But lo and behold, he left this experiment running for quite a number of days, and as Andrew Crosse writes, at the end of 14 days, I observed 2 or 3 very minute specks on the surface of the stone, which he was electrocuting, white and somewhat elevated. Okay, so he's noticing these strange growths on the stone, which he has immersed in some sort of acidic or potassium solution. Let's call it a scientific solution for our purposes. And then this white specks are appearing. No, they could be anything. They could be crystals. They could be, I don't know, oxidation. I don't know. They could be purely chemical phenomena. But listen to this now. This is actually, I'm reading from Andrew Crosse's actual article, by the way. So these are his words. And he said, on the 22nd day, each of these figures assumed a more definite form, still enlarging. They're growing. And then on the 18th day, oops, I kind of gave you an advanced sneak preview. So this happens before what I just read. On the 18th day, fine filaments projected from each of these specks or nipples, and the whole figure was increased in size. So they grow into some hairy specks or something. And then he says, this is my favorite sentence, by the way, on the 26th day, each nipple assumed the form of a perfect insect, standing upright on 4 or 5 bristles, which forms its tail. And the perfect insect apparently looks like something on the right-hand side of this video image, a bit like a mite. So for some reason he made mites grow out of the solution he was preparing. And then on the 28th day, each insect begins moving its legs, and in a day or two they detach themselves from the stone and they're starting to move around. And of course these are mites. If you were ever, as a kid, looking really closely at concrete or stones or sand, you would see these like little reddish or white, very tiny animals moving about. So that's what he was seeing. He was seeing what most people believe were either cheese mites or dust mites. But the interesting thing was these things appear to be generated out of this electrical chemical experiment he was making. So, long story short, at no point of the experiment did Andrew Crosse claim he was out there to create life. In fact, these insects were observed as a byproduct of the experiment, and he just noticed them. And later on, he actually assumed quite in a based way that the eggs were probably contaminating his instruments, and at no point of this article did he claim to create life. But for some reason, this report was so well received and was such a sensation at the time. You know, it might be 1837, but not everybody in the Victorian age walks around like Harry Potter. You know, people are still attached to media sensation in a similar way to the present day. People have been constantly the same in that respect. So this story grew and in bounds, and people started to report it in newspapers that this guy was creating life, was playing God, or it's claimed that Andrew Crosse received death threats because he was like, how dare you create life? Only the Lord can give life. So on and so forth. And that was it, really. I mean, he claimed that these were mites. He, in fact, named them. What did he name them? Sorry. Well, there was a note here. Something like Acarus crossi. So these mites were named by him or probably after him. So these things got their little scientific names, and the perfect insect start as a nipple. Next thing you know, they're walking around on 4 or 5 filamentous legs. How badass are these dudes? They got only one mode. Go! Okay, so these guys are all business all the time. But this story of Andrew Crosse gets repeated in many online sources, especially those kinds of sources who are like a little bit into the occult, but not too much, a little bit into weird science, but not too much, just the tip. And this kind of like meta-scientific, quasi-occult. It's always reported as if Crosse was a kind of influence for Frankenstein, or like was this kind of quirky Victorian scientist who discovered a way to create life before he was erased by the establishment. But none of these things are true. In fact, the story looks remarkably like Frankenstein, but actually he's probably not the originator of Frankenstein, because this experiment was published a few years after the book by Mary Shelley. So how can we make that connection then? Well, back in that day, everybody was very excited about electricity, and today you got people writing code and like developing stuff. Like back then, you had people experimenting with voltaic piles or galvanic generators or atmospheric electricity. It was like the cutting edge of not just of science, but if you were like a man about town, if you were like a man of letters, you had to dabble a little in electricity. Like Benjamin Franklin is no different. I mean, he's a first-rate genius too, of course, but like in that day and age, if you were like anybody worth their salt, you had to be scientifically literate, and even if you were not a proper scientist, you had to like do stuff with electricity, because that was the cool thing back then. And with all that popularity, it is no surprise that Mary Shelley, quite independently from Andrew Crosse, hit upon the idea of electricity as a life-giving essence or a life-giving force. Heck, I mean, this thing was around, this idea of electricity as a source of life was around for a very long time, ever since that French or Italian dude a century or so before Andrew Crosse. I don't remember his name right now, but he's a famous guy who like cut up some frog legs and then he hooked them up to some sort of galvanic pile, and the frog legs started going, "Hello my baby, hello my honey." They started dancing around. I mean, it's just a no-brainer. So, many myths about Andrew Crosse are not correct. Suffice it to say, he was not a crazy scientist. He did not claim to create life. He did not hit upon a way of creating alchemic life that was somehow censored or erased by the establishment later on, and he did not influence Frankenstein. Nevertheless, he was quite a based and serious scientist, and he's got quite a reputation. And he's not the first or the only scientist to have claimed to have created life through abiogenesis, that is to say, generating life out of non-living substances. So now that we've finished our discussion of Andrew Crosse, let's look at some other scientists who had similar claims. There's a few of them. I could dig up the names of two. For example, there's this guy named Morley Martin. That's Morleymartin, Martin. And in 1927, he made this bizarre experiment where he took stones from Azoic stone formations. That is to say, he took stone from layers of the earth that were so old that life hadn't formed or fossilized by then. Okay, all right. Then he ground them up into a fine dust. Interesting. Then he subjected them to X-rays. Remember, this is 1927. The Röntgen discovery of X-rays is still quite new, and much like electricity in the mid-19th century, X-rays are the thing now. So what Morley Martin did was subject them to X-rays and then claim to see the ground up mud organizing itself into forms of fish or primordial creatures. That's extremely bizarre, and if you know anything about science, it's kind of a crank claim. And to nobody's surprise, these results were not replicated, and it seems that Morley Martin was just overexcited, or maybe he was seeing shapes. Oh, I don't know. Maybe he was a quack, but it's still a cool experiment. Imagine if that was real. Imagine if you could take stones from any fossil formation, ground them up into mud, dust, hit them up with the X-rays, rays, and they assume the shape of any animal that lived during that time. You take some fossil Jurassic era stones, you X-ray those bitches, and suddenly you get microscopic dinosaurs. That would be really cool. That's one angle I really like to consider when I'm going through all these like strange reports of science or quack scientific theories, that it's always a nice way of science fiction and a nice way to relax, really, to consider the implications if those theories were actually true. Well, in Andrew Crosse's case, you could assume, for example, that imagine this really was the case and you could really like hit up acid with electricity and you could see tiny mites forming. Imagine you had this kind of way to create perfect insect life. Imagine if that was the way the universe worked. That would be very cool. You could like make a whole generator of these things, zap them up with electricity and little mites come up. Maybe you could even like mess with the formula of the acid so you could generate any type of insect you wish. You kind of put the stone in the acidic potash solution, zap it up. What do you see? Cockroaches. 10 million cockroaches for free. Now, if that was the case, keeping reptiles or little animals that eat cockroaches would be a hell of a lot easier. But it's not. You could even play practical jokes on people, like electrocute the floor and the whole house gets infested by mites or roaches or pubic lice or jumping spiders, I don't know. How far the parameters of that thing would go? I mean, is it just for creating the most primitive form of mite? Or does it just does it also work for arachnids? Remember, mites are related to spiders and scorpions. So maybe if you like change the formula a bit, zap the thing, boom, endless scorpions. How cool is that? Throw them around, eat them, or like just set them wild. Cool, scorpion maker. You could even like arrange this into such a circuit that you don't need to electrocute the whole solution, but you would have something like the printing head of a DMC. What was that?
DMC 12?
Direct garment transfer.
DMC. Yeah.
Anyway, there are these printers that print on t-shirts or whatever. So like, I'm getting ahead of myself. Imagine you get this, instead of this, imagine the whole thing is real, that Crosse's formula somehow works. You could generate arachnids at will, and you could even build a specific circuit. So instead of having a big experimental setup, you could have this like thing like a remote control. It uses electricity from the batteries, and the stone and the formula to be electrocuted are like pre-installed, like a circuit wafer. And you press the button, boom, out comes a scorpion. Press the button, boom, out comes a wolf spider. You press the button, boom, out comes a mite. Press the button again, out comes a tick. You could have this funny tools if that was the case. But that is not the case. So let's close this long tangent and go back to other scientists who claim to have created life. One was Morley Martin. We reviewed him earlier. He was like using fossil rock to create fish. I don't know. But he was, clearly his experiments were not replicated. So then there was this other guy called John Butler Burke. And he claimed to have created radiobes. So not microbes, but radiobes in 1906. So he did some experiments using radium, the element, the radioactive element, and he claimed to have produced cell-like structures called radiobes. But of course, this experiment was also not repeated. Perhaps he did create some structures, but they could be inorganic molecules, or it could be some contamination of the whole thing by bacteria. We know today that there are bacteria who can withstand quite strong bouts of radiation, and maybe that was a contamination, but nobody knows. But he just deserves respect. John Butler Burke deserves respect even for coining the term radiobes. They're just vibing. Yeah. 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 Chill out with radium and get the radiobes to take you away. That also kind of reminds me of this other idea used in science fiction. So until quite recently, like I'm talking about 1960s, 70s, you would see this idea of radioactive life in science fiction books, usually cheap ones. And the idea here was that there could be another entire other domain of life whose transport of energy is not managed by turning sunlight into an energy-giving ATP molecule and then metabolizing that. That's our whole domain of life works that way. Sunlight, photosynthesis, chemosynthesis happens too, but mainly photosynthesis. Then energy gets locked into these ATP molecules, and then everything uses that for fuel, and you get the whole chains of life, food chains and all that. Now, in these old science fiction stories, you have this other energy plausibility for life explored. I don't know if it's viable at all. It's just the idea I've encountered while reading science fiction. But the idea goes much like these radiobes. The energy doesn't come from sunlight or whatever. The energy comes directly from the decay of radioactive elements. So it's got a finite lifespan, but it's there, and it's like in that duration of time, it's pretty much inexhaustible. It dies down at the end, of course, but for example, the great science fiction author Olaf Stapledon, is Olaf Stapledon, just Google his name, has a book called Star Maker and it's about the whole universe. It's like one of the 3 most important books ever written in this century, I believe. So in his book, this idea is explored too. The planet of Venus is home to these radioactive creatures, and their whole energy chain is based on the decay of radioactive elements, and it's just fascinating to consider how life like that might evolve. So it's a whole different game of economics. Instead of metabolizing an available universal energy source, there's a limited energy source that's constantly decaying, and the whole architecture of life has to be built around that. It's a bit like those upside down spikes that hang from cave ceilings, stalactites or stalagmites, I don't remember. But anyways, that's another wild parenthesis that we are now closing as we get ready to say goodbye. But before that, let's look at this idea of spontaneous generation. It seems to have influenced people of science every time there was a new discovery, especially in these last 2 centuries. So when electricity was a thing, people wanted to believe that electricity could bring about spontaneous generation. Or when radioactivity was a thing, radiobes were the vibe. Or when X-rays were the thing, Morley Martin claimed to see X-rays creating fish. So it kind of tells us something about the way we look at science and the way we look at life. And even today, I think there are echoes of that. Now, nobody seems to be claiming to create life these days. But guess what, man? You got this whole computer boom craze these days. Everybody's building a machine or making an app or coding stuff. So that's like the groundwork, or the active side of techno-scientific advance in the present day. I guess we could all agree on that. Okay. So in these days, there's nobody who's claiming to create radios or X-ray fish or whatever. But guess what? There's 1,000 million people claiming to create artificial intelligence. It's going to replace us, man. AI is going to take your job. It's going to take your job. That's kind of like, if you consider what we've been like talking about for the past half hour, it's kind of in a similar vibe. People expect like new life to come from this active area of scientific inquiry at that time. People want the fashionable science to be the source of new life. Even if they don't tell it really directly, I mean, I think 89% of all bullshit spoken about artificial intelligence comes down to that. And then you got these other theories like, if artificial intelligence existed, would that intelligence be a person or not a person? The way to go with those circular arguments. And it's my, like, well-founded opinion that artificial intelligence will never come in a shape equal to human intelligence or even animal intelligence, because it cannot take initiative, or it cannot assume things or assume itself to be alive. What AI can do best, and what it can do much better than any of us, is doing repetitive tasks really fast. And in that respect, it's not, architecturally speaking, it's not too different from computers in general. But it's got a long way to go, and it could really surprise us. But I don't expect to see an artificial intelligence. If an AI was here, sitting down with me, I would expect no AI to laugh at the joke when I say, hey man, radios are vibing. They couldn't understand that. Only you people can understand it. So, you're worth something, man. You can laugh at my shitty jokes. You're better than all AI that has ever come or will ever exist. Whoa, so that was another long tangent, but I hope I managed to hint at you how popular science always brings about these characters who want that decade's popular thing to be the source of new life, or to replace life, or to create new life. These guys always exist. I don't know why. But the idea of spontaneously creating life from non-living materials is quite an old one, actually. I mean, it was summarized and set into a framework by Aristotle himself in the ancient days. And a lot of ancient philosophers believed that was how life started, because they had not observed minute details like tiny insects reproducing, or it was just assumed folk wisdom that somehow found its way into scientific understanding. For example, Anaximander, a Greek philosopher, he considered, so another philosopher named Censorius writes in the 3rd century that he is writing about spontaneous generation, and he says, Anaximander considered that from warm water emerged fish, or fish-like animals. Inside these animals, humans took form, and embryos were held prisoners until puberty. Okay, so you got like warm water, fish comes out of the water, and the fish is full of teenagers. And Sensorius continues quoting from Anaximander. Only then, after these animals burst open, could man and woman come out, now able to crawl about and feed themselves. Isn't that cool? I mean, that's just bizarre. But faced with the stunning diversity and inexplicable complexity of life, this was what people believed in one form or the other until the onset of the Renaissance, where that Italian dude did this experiment where he had this flask, sealed glass, and he sterilized it. So he made 2 of these flasks. Well, one of them was sealed. The other he broke open. And after a week, the open flask was contaminated by bacteria, and the sealed flask was just as sterile as ever. So he conclusively, wait a minute, I think all life comes from other life. Seems so intuitive to us, doesn't it? But for a long time, people actually could not even comprehend this. To them, if you left like some rags in the corner, they turn into rats. Or if they were thinking about the origin of humanity, it was like water turning to fish and bursting into teenagers on a beach. I wish all teenagers were produced that way. But they are not. You have to you have to put them through school and make the baby and feed it and wipe its shit and buy them some diapers and stuff. That's just not cool. And there were many, many varieties on this idea. For example, another philosopher named Empedocles believed that weird lifelike shapes were being created all the time in the depths of the seas. But he had a caveat. Empedocles believed that only the functional shapes survived. So we have like fish that look like fish because that's the only way to survive. But according to Empedocles, the seas or whatever the base elements were constantly producing life forms. Most of them like monsters, like, I don't know, the fish with 2 butts or just a head or just a dick, stuff like that. But they don't survive. They get selected. That was Empedocles' theory. And what does that remind you of? Doesn't that remind... They were like so close to figuring out something like Darwinian evolution. If Empedocles had only said something like, yeah, all these weird shapes get selected, but guess what? Weird shapes, if he could only make that mental leap, and if he could only say that life forms come from other life forms and they get selected, boom! Centuries before Darwin, you had something like a Darwinian theory of evolution. And we'd all be living in big cities and traveling in flying cars by now. Now, of course not. But it's just very fascinating to consider. I mean, a lot of the ideas we take for granted, we almost take them as granted as, oh yeah, the sky is blue. Evolution, sky is blue. Yeah, survival of the fittest. Yeah, adaptation. Guess what? It took people centuries to figure these out. And they had to make these mental bridges and leaps and connect ideas and observations in such ways. That's just one of the things that I personally find fascinating about history of science and the history of ideas in general. And guess what? This shit isn't over yet. In 200, 300 years, people are gonna bridge other facts of life and other theories. I personally predict these are gonna be about the nature of time in 4 dimensions. And I think we still have 1 or 2 more earth-shaking boundary leaps to be experienced in the way we view life itself, what happens in brain cells, and some stuff with quantum physics. Like, there are, in the future, unfathomable leaps of idea development in science that we, even in our 21st century AI, we're still blind to. And man, what an experience that's going to be. That's like, if I had a time machine, I would just go forward and see the new paradigm shifts in science. And they're going to be really exciting. And before finishing, there's actually, I'd like to make you one book recommendation. Remember we talked about how it would really be if these theories of abiogenesis were true. Well, there's a really, really nice science fiction story by an author called Richard Garfinkel, Celestial Matters. I'm not going to bother with coding the names. It's just on the video description. Go down below to find this book. It's an amazing book because it assumes that science was real as it was understood at the time of Aristotle. So the earth is flat, all these planets go around the earth, and actually people could, the moon is made out of this strange material that through its very material nature is predisposed to rotating around the earth and flying. So people carve ships out of moon rock and fly in the heavens and fight. So it's a really cool story. And there's dozens of scientific worldview tricks like that in the book. So one of the tricks in that book is actually people are on this moon ship, they're flying about, and the way they obtain their food is they just have these abiogenesis tanks, and they combine human sweat, tears, or moisture or whatever, and the entire tank turns into sheep or chickens or something. So they spontaneously generate their organic meat, and that's how the people of the world or the crews of these moon ships in that book feed themselves. So it's a really nice exercise of ideas and a really nice book, Celestial Matters by Richard Garfinkel. So that was that, everyone. This was the story of Andrew Crosse, the man who could, in brackets, create life. Through examining his story, we saw basically a very broad overview of abiogenetic theories and how science or popular science always has this desire to create life or play God in the most basic normie way imaginable. And then we looked at the history of the idea, and it was just fun. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I promised myself I'd keep it short, but it's been 40 minutes already. So I hope you like this. If you have any comments or ideas or corrections to make, please let me know in the comment section, and please donate me money on patreon.com. Life is not spontaneously generated, and neither is money. But with your help, some money could spontaneously radio itself in my bank account. And it really doesn't matter. If you give $1, that's perfectly fine. Give me $1 a month. If enough of you do this, I will have more time to make these amazing podcasts and research these weird ideas, and I'll have more time to devote to this. And at any case, and in any way, I hope you are having a nice time, a nice day, and until we meet again, this has been CM Kozaman, and I wish you all a nice summer in 2020. Goodbye.